Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast, the series where I speak to people that can help us better understand human decision making and how we can influence it. Now this episode sees the return of a guest I spoke with fairly recently. Though to be honest, given Corona time, it could have been anything from a week ago to a year ago, who knows? But I've had so much positive feedback about her last appearance that I wanted to get her back on the pod. Partly because the subject we were discussing became headline news as a result of events in the US shortly after we last recorded. Dr. Grace Lordan is an Associate Professor in Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics, and she specialises in the effects of unconscious bias, discrimination and technology changes. Last time she was on, we talked about diversity, and this time we look at the topic of privilege. What does it mean? How does it manifest itself? Why that's a problem? And what we can do about it. Now, as someone who's had undeniably a privileged upbringing, the issues Grace raises are things I need to explore in terms of my own life and career. That's not always easy, but Grace makes a really good case for why it's important. And I came away from our discussion with a real sense that what she's exploring in her research is not only interesting, but hugely beneficial, both to society and to business. If we want to deal with the challenges we're facing as a planet, we're going to need to maximise our potential as a species. And that requires us to look at what things aren't working as well as they could. Privilege is a huge distortion. We also explore the concept of cognitive diversity. The idea that the real benefit of diversity is to bring different ways of thinking and experiences to problem solving. Of course, that's partly achieved by bringing people with obviously different life stories together. But we need to make sure that those voices aren't just echoing the existing narratives. For real challenge and progress, we need cognitive diversity. The reason both of these are relevant to human risk is that in order to minimise poor decision making, we need to encourage challenge and open discussion. Equally, building work environments that allow people to be themselves and maximise their potential leads to more innovation, greater creativity and better risk management. In short, if we're employing people, then we need to think about how we can help get the most out of them. The good news is that even though these are massive issues, Grace has some great ideas on how to start to think about them and what potential solutions might look like. She's also a lot of fun, which made discussing these really important topics that much easier. So please enjoy my discussion with Dr. Grace Lordan on privilege and cognitive diversity. So Grace, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you. It's really nice to be back. Thank you, Christian.
It's great to have you back here because I got so much positive feedback from your last appearance that I was desperate to have you back on. And of course, since we spoke, there have been any number of things happening that mean this topic is even more up and forefront in people's minds. So I think getting your views and experience on this, I think, is incredibly timely and valuable. And I wanted to sort of start off by looking at this idea of privilege. And we talk, you're hearing a lot about the term. And, as a white middle-aged male, that sort of screams out at me. But I wonder if you could sort of unpack for people what we mean by that and the sort of challenges as we think about that.
So I think if you take kind of a behavioural science class and you think about an outcome that a person might have in their life, like what job they end up with or how much they end up earning, you find people will say to you, there's two things that matter: the effort that you put in and also the luck. And your ability is fixed actually in that. So there's kind of there's two things that can actually affect that. But I think when we think about luck, compounded in that is the idea of privilege, right? So you have random luck that happens to you. So if I'm walking down the street and I happen to bump into somebody, that's randomness. But very often the networks are developed by these kind of warm introductions. So I might get to meet a friend of yours because I've been talking to you today. And I might never have ended up talking on this podcast if I were not at the LSE. So in some ways, it's a privilege for me to work at the LSE if you think about it that way. And, I grew up in a working class background in a small area in Cork. Totally did not think about privilege one way or the other. I'll be very honest about it, because most people knew each other. And if you wanted to kind of meet somebody, you would just ask somebody who always knew somebody where you could get it. But when you move to some place like London and you really stop and think about where you happen to be born, where your parents happen to work in when you are born, the school that you go to, so the peers who you get to meet, all of this really impacts really impacts on how you live your life. To the extent that any intervention that we might choose to do in schools that are disadvantages of behavioural scientists, it's very remiss that we don't think about general equilibrium effects. And what I mean by that is if I'm doing an intervention to try to change privilege, so for example, I'm really interested in role models, so I want to do this really big study in schools where we bring really effective role models to meet kids and break down information barriers. But if that was really super effective, then do we really think that the parents who are sending their kids to the fee-paying schools are going to sit quietly and do nothing? No, they're going to think about some other way in order to get their kids the edge. And that's really, really important. And, you know, what I really like about the Black Lives Matter movements is now we're having those hard conversations, because I, as somebody who works in behavioural science and talks about this a lot, I really think about privilege a lot and how it actually pushes people along. So we all see our tailwinds very easily. So we see what's pushing against us. So there might be kind of things that I could talk to you about that I see work negatively against me. But it's very hard to kind of see the headwinds. So what are the things that actually allow you to do well in life? And I think it's hard for us as people to see headwinds because we like to attribute our efforts and where we end up all to ourselves. We rarely want to admit, I only got there because I happened to run into Mr. or Mrs. X on the street on any one particular day. And I think what the Black Lives Matter has done for me is that it's really taught me from talking to people that even though I know privilege really, really matters a lot, there's types of privilege that because I've never experienced not having them, I'm not cognizant of it when it's happening to other people. And I think that's different. So I think if we really want to break down these kind of privilege barriers in society, while we all know privilege matters, and we all know it's probably something that really has got us to where we are in life in various different guises, not only recognizing what your own privileges are, but recognizing what other people are missing out on is really important. And we only get that from having hard conversations. There's no kind of theory of behavioral science that will give me that, actually. So for me, it's been kind of this huge educational moment, actually, where I've learned more about the types of privileges that I have never actually thought about because I've had them. And knowing that then really makes me think twice about who I think is good in any particular moment.
It is really interesting, this narrative of sort of success.
Yes.
Because as you say, you know, when we interview any athlete or successful business person, and they'll talk about single-minded determinant and all this. And it's only the sort of slightly self-deprecating ones that go, well, I got lucky. But the key narrative that's always out there is hard work gets you places.
Yes.
And that sort of seems to be the basic thing. And that's the message that gets transmitted to everybody. And so I think there's that prevailing. And then the second bit is clearly it's really awkward to unpick the things that are just sort of built into your life that you just take for granted. And so, you know, one of the things I've been reflecting on is to sort of go, well, you know, how have I ended up here? And I can paint that hard-working picture, but I could equally paint one going, well, as you say, these things only happen. But that's a really awkward conversation for me to have with myself, because it kind of requires me to paint a universe that's you know, sort of parallel universe, if you like, that is difficult to imagine. And so it's not really surprising. It's a challenging dialogue we have.
I mean, I've thought about this a lot recently, and I'll tell you why in a second, but I think the message is the right one, that, you know, hard work will get you places, because that actually is the only thing really at the individual level you can control, you know, so you can hard work and putting yourself into new networks will pay off. You might not have a warm introduction, but you might end up getting in there. So you might get lucky and somebody welcomes you into the network. Hard work and getting skilled at your craft will absolutely help you get where you go. But where I think that the privilege conversation needs to happen is that it needs to happen in places where we care about equality. It needs to happen in government. It needs to happen in universities when we're admitting our students. It needs to happen in firms when we're hiring. You know, that there's a great study out there that basically shows that folk who get distinctions in kind of second and third tier universities are much less likely to get a job as compared to somebody who gets a second class honours or a merit in top tier universities. Now, if you think about that, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because actually, if you're a kid who's gone through a second and third year university and has managed to get a distinction, particularly if you've worked part-time because you couldn't afford to actually go, so you needed to pay off your student debts. For me, that person is much more impressive than the person who gets the merit in the top tier university. But what actually happens rolls around the other way. And the reason that I've talked about it so much that I actually wrote this book recently that talks about what individuals can do to advance their careers. And there's a whole chapter in there on other people's biases. And the editor kept coming back to me saying, this is the most depressing chapter. You need to actually give some good news. You can't put your reader in a place where you're saying, look, these biases happen to you and there's some things you can do, but probably, not a lot. But I do think that it has to come from people who are making decisions on outcomes and people who are choosing. So now I'm in a choice basically when I'm thinking about hiring somebody. Do I choose the person who has done well, given that they had a whole load of privilege around them as evident for their CV? Or do I choose somebody who actually is really signaling to me that they could do incredibly well and it's been all them and there's no evidence of privilege in their CV? And the world that we're in now would choose the first person. And I think actually starting to question that becomes really important. And, moving towards task-based interviews rather than me sitting down with somebody and really focusing on their CV is one way that we can actually get around it. But I do think that we need to have hard conversations about what privilege is. Otherwise, you'd have people who are talking about privilege mattering, like myself, who still mightn't understand the types of things that people are actually missing out on because it's not salient to me, because I'm not missing out on them. So I'm not feeling the loss.
And that's a really interesting point. And if I think about university, lots of points in there, but there's just the general concept of the sort of badging becomes critical. And the fact that I got in somewhere X years ago, that's a point in time where you passed a certain test. And you're right to question the basis on which that test was by. So sure, achievement at that point in time for whatever reason, but that label does stick with you. And I happen to have gone to a very good university, and I don't go around shouting about it, but if someone asks the question, I don't shy away from it either. But it's really interesting. You're right, because you sort of go, well, why should my future be dependent on that one? That, in my case, that one or two interviews. Yeah. And I got the grades and things that you need to get there, but it was that and so everything is kind of shaped that, and I think that's a really interesting bit. We sort of badge things. I was thinking about it's almost a little bit like branding of products, where you get a decent manufacturer can make something slightly crap, as opposed to someone we've never heard of or heard of less who makes something really that's actually better, but we tend to buy the product from the better known brand. So there's a sort of thing in human thinking, which is this heuristic of I can judge I can judge the quality thing by dint of the branding around this individual. And of course, we know that from reality that's quite a flawed approach.
And this is classic statistical discrimination, right? So in the example that you've given about this kind of car manufacturer that has this legacy of making kind of good cars in the past, they can get away with putting out a car that isn't necessarily as good because they have this kind of stock of knowledge in people's minds. So when we're busy and we're trying to make a decision, we look for signals of quality. And one of the things that I'm really looking forward to actually expanding my research on in the next few years is really thinking about signals that do work and signals that don't work. So signals are never going to be perfect, but we have signals, for example, that are going to be highly correlated with ability, like whether you got a distinction in your university, regardless of what university you went to. That will signal to us that you're actually looking at somebody who's good, who's really, really academically good. However, wearing a suit to the interview tells us nothing about whether or not a person is actually academically good. So if you're looking for somebody academically good, perhaps we shouldn't actually weigh a lot in how people actually present themselves in any one moment. And really distinguishing from signals that if I'm privileged, I can learn about, like wearing the suit in the simplest cases. And not just the suit, by the way. So as I get older, I realize there's kind of different types of suits that you can actually wear that signal, different things. If you're in that club and you do that signaling, that can give you an edge in getting a job. But of course, you only know about that if you have the privilege to be in circles where people actually tell you about it, but this is something that you should actually do to signal your interest. So either removing those signals or making it known to people what those signals are becomes really important if we want to break down privilege. But the second one, I don't like so much because it's like the school example that I just spoke about. As soon as we basically let everyone know what the signals are. So if I blog about it, and God forbid I have no followers and people read it, so if I blog about it and people read it, and then everyone knows, then people who are privileged will just come up with different signals. So it's really interesting to think about breaking signaling down, because it always happens that we want to live in an equal society and we want what's best for the group. But as individuals, we tend to do what's better for ourselves. And then if you have people who are in positions to access things in differential ways, once we have at least a certain amount of those individuals, it's going to be really hard to break down those privilege barriers. But I think what the Black Lives Movement has really done incredibly well, amongst many other things, is get people talking about it and actually get people listening to the type of experiences that other people have had. And even though you can't identify with it, you would, if you were in that situation, know you wouldn't like it. So letting people kind of go with those barriers still up, I think is no longer acceptable. Figuring out how to bring them down is really the next step. And that's why I really want people to take action more than just talking about this.
And you say everybody wants an equal society. And I would love to believe that's true. But my sort of challenge to that would be that to a certain extent, if you have benefited from privilege, you could say, and I could sort of point to people, and not people I necessarily know, but people I sort of make a presumption about. So again, a biased viewpoint from me, but where I sort of go, well, they don't seem to want that. And so, some of the greatest, if we look at sort of politicians, there are a large number of politicians who make a lot of noise about wanting one thing, and then you look at the impact of their policies, and it's an entirely different one. A bit like I'm always reminded when you go to organizations and someone wangs on about it being meritocracy. And you know damn well that if it were a meritocracy, they wouldn't be in their position, because it's always the people that feel most awkward about it that feel the need to say something, because if it was obvious, you wouldn't need to say anything. And so I sort of think, if you're in a position where you can talk about it being meritocracy, you probably, you're feeling guilty. So to a certain extent, there is a sort of inbuilt guilt thing about it. But I wonder do people genuinely want that, do you think? I mean, is that innate in all of us? And therefore, if push came to shove, these people that I would hold out to not want that in terms of their behaviors would actually come down to that thing? Or is there a subset of people that don't actually want it?
Well, if I said that, what I should have said was everyone says they want an equal society, at least particularly in professional jobs. And because everyone says they want an equal society, we've ended up in this kind of status quo that I really don't like. That it's quite popular for you to say that you care about diversity and you care about inclusion, but not necessarily have to do anything about it. So you are right. We see politicians making these great statements about wanting to kind of change the world and change opportunities for people at both the school level and the tertiary education level. And then nothing really, really happens. And I think to move beyond that, we need to push for action rather than words. So if I'm going to be out there saying that I care about a particular issue, then I'm also saying what I'm going to do about it. And also people should be auditing whether or not people actually do what they say. Now, people like you and I might be able to get away with saying things and it not being audited for a while. But I think we're now in a position where if somebody says something, their feet should be held to the fire about why they're actually doing something about it. So I don't want people kind of standing up and saying to me that they care about the Black Lives Matter movement without saying, this is the time I'm going to put into it, this is the money I'm going to put into it. And more than that, this is where the money is actually going to go. And having people at the table who know about the Black Lives Matter movement, giving advice on whether or not it's actually going in the right place. Because otherwise we're just in this kind of situation of virtue signaling, which doesn't help people who are actually pushing for a very, very, very important cause. And I think that's across the board when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So it's okay to do an intervention and the intervention doesn't have an effect because we don't know ahead of time whether or not something will work. That actually is an important question. But if you do kind of embrace the spirit of behavioural science and actually start measuring the interventions that you put out there, knowing whether or not they're working, being honest about backfiring effects, those are the type of leaders that we want in organizations, and those are the type of leaders that we want in countries. We don't want to be in the status quo that we are now, where people talk about diversity and inclusion a lot and blame pipelines and blame lack of talent and blame, there's always something that's somebody else's fault. I think just thinking about, okay, if I care about this, what is it that I can do? And actually in 3 years' time, when you look back at me, will I be able to prove that I've done it? Have I given time? Have I given resources? And have I been honest about the effects? So yes, I think these days in professional jobs, everyone does say they want an equal society. So maybe it's the time we start kind of putting feet to the fire. And if that's the platform that you want to run on, then give us a more equal society.
And I'm struck by the comment you made earlier around if you gave away the sort of details of the processes that you're going to run, people would try and game it.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, one of the challenges here is that clearly there are some things I think we can agree that everybody it's not a competition, but there are some things where there is a competition, where there's limited amounts of spaces, and we can argue as to whether there should be more. So if I think of higher education, for example, you could turn around and go, I would love to have everybody should be able to go to top universities, but that's just not feasible. And so one of the challenges is if I am privileged and I push inequality, I'm going to lose out. And you can so the implicit piece in the message you've got around, getting into decent schools, getting into jobs, parents get very competitive to make sure their kids are looked after. It's a natural thing that they want to do. But clearly there's a piece where you go, if I go for I'm going to lose out, or my family or my crowd, if you like, are going to lose out. That's quite tough.
It is. I mean, it is tough. But I think, so kind of let's think about it from society's point of view. So if you think about skills, ability and talent, that's why we want to recruit people in university. We should be taking down the barriers to make sure that the most skilled, the person with the highest ability, the person with the best talent is getting through the door. And if we're not doing that, we're losing out for two reasons. So firstly, we're losing out as a society because the best people aren't actually getting to study things. But secondly, I think if we don't do it that way, we're losing out as a society because we end up with having people who are in extraordinarily powerful positions, for example, the government is the obvious one, who don't actually represent the people that they're meeting. So if we remove the barriers and people who do come from a lower socioeconomic background with high skills, ability and talent, we knew for sure they would always get through, then we actually probably will end up with a better government. And I think at an individual level, you are right. That will mean that there's kind of a reshuffling. I actually think, by the way, if we get people with higher levels of skills, ability and talent into universities and we get better representation in government, in product creation, we will have growth. So it probably isn't strictly a zero-sum game. Yeah. But even if it were, I think at the individual level, that's something that I'm willing to sacrifice. I feel less comfortable with us never shuffling around people across class.
Right.
So, for example, think about a kid that you might have in your mind who's from the highest decile, who doesn't have the skills, ability and talent to get into university. He or she will end up still being taken care of financially because their parents are relatively wealthy. So we don't need to worry about them actually from the perspective of standard of living. They just mightn't necessarily get into the job. But that's the right choice because let's imagine in this thought experiment, they're much, much lower ranked than the kid who comes from the lowest decile. Now, not only are we actually being fairer to that kid because we're rewarding them for their skills, ability and talent, but we're getting somebody into that job who's a higher kind of skills, ability and talent. And had they not gone into that job, we might actually have to worry about them eating and how they will kind of financially. So the reshuffling in mobility is actually good for society because wealth is passed down across generations. So I don't worry so much about it. I think the problem is if it really were meritocracy, which is extraordinarily hard to build, by the way, but if it really were, would there always be these kind of artificial privileges that end up being created? And so I think that's, for sure, mobility is based on skills, ability, and talent. It is the right way, but we also need to, when we meet them, because I don't meet students until they come to me in masters, so they have a very different life experiences up to when they meet me, and I have to really think about how much input has gone into that person. So if I look at their ideas and they're really, really great, but they're a bit less kind of put together than I might expect in a master's student, if they haven't had input, for me, that's an amazing student that they've gotten to that stage on their own, actually. And stripping that out it takes time. It takes you stopping and actually looking at people. And a lot of the statistical discrimination problem that we have is because people are too busy to assess quality of both the person standing in front of them, or to use your car analogy of a car manufacturer who've now kind of created this substandard vehicle.
Wow. So much to unpack. And there's something interesting, I think, about people with massive amounts of privilege. And again, I've got certain members of parliament in my head just because that's the easiest go-to place. But foreign listeners can pick their own examples because they will exist everywhere. But there is this strange thing where actually, people sort of go, I'm really good because I went to this top university, I got these top grades. But they kind of know that's, and so there's actually, ironically, I think as you were depicting that picture of sort of what's best for society, in a way, there's pressure heaped on these people where they probably aren't necessarily the best, and it's probably not the best thing for their skills, and yet they've been forced into this particular thing because that's sort of what is expected of you in that space. And I think there's something really interesting around the way that we educate people, in that there are certain paths that are perceived to be better than others. So, there's a sensible thing to do. historically. And that sensible thing involves taking, if you've been to the right school, you should probably be aiming for these sorts of universities. And it's sort of found. So there's this pressure on people, which kind of it forces them down a path that is probably not good for them as individuals. And I see sort of people that I think are massively out of their depth, but they've been pushed into a particular rat race because of the path that they've been on. So I think that's a really healthy way of looking at it, which is not just to sort of say, we need to look after the people that don't have, but actually the people that are stuck in this system are probably not as comfortable as they would be if we could deal with some of the issues as well. So it's not just advantage versus disadvantage. I think there's challenges on both sides.
It's really interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that we do quite badly for kids in the UK and actually in pretty much every other country is really set them up to know what they actually want to do later in life. So there will be kids who you'll meet who want to be a doctor, want to be a lawyer, one of these kind of mainstream careers, and they'll be able to see themselves in that role from the day that they could talk. But for the majority of kids, they have a really bad idea about what tasks are actually involved in particular jobs, and also whether or not they'll actually like doing them. And I think coupled with that, you've hit it right, it is, parents really putting pressure on kids to do a particular task. And I think that there's a responsibility from the education system as we move forward to really think about developing core skills in kids. And I have a good friend, Lucy Bailey, who I partnered with her on this core skill curriculum that she derived, and we rolled it out in schools to look at how it actually affect children. And by working with her on that, it really got me thinking about the type of kids that we're building within education systems. And I think one of them is really kind of giving them much more knowledge about career choice and empowering them to really think about what they actually like very, very early on, so they don't just succumb to social norms and end up miserable. These days we spend so much time working. The idea that we're actually putting kids into jobs they don't like really doesn't sit well with me.
Right.
But I think the second thing, again, these core skills are better for society. So there's kind of two things you think about a job. You have the skill to do a job and whether or not you like it. And I would much prefer to be hiring people who really want to come and work with me at the LSE, right? And that they don't have this kind of pipe dream of, being a lawyer or being a surfer or whatever else they could have done. Two very odd career choices to come up with. But, they're not mine, by the way. But they're not kind of sitting there hankering kind of to do something else. You want someone who wants to be there, because when we think about the outcome in any job, it's not just your skills, kind of inherent skill. The effort really matters. And people who are happier at work and better matched do put in better effort. And not only that, they make people happier around them. Because the last thing you want is somebody who's badly matched for the job kind of being your colleague, right? Because you're going to pay for that, either in silence or in words. But either way, you're going to pay for it. So yes, no, I agree with you. I think if you do come from a family who has had particular professions in the past, there are these pressures. And I think really, again, rethinking that as a society. And, I have some friends who actually have been extraordinarily brave in this and really encourage their kids to figure out what they want to do for themselves, with giving them some assistance with that. So they're not, it's not just kind of a free for all. And that's how I kind of see developing core skills, that you have somebody guiding you, but you get to kind of figure out what you actually like and what you don't like.
Because, that is really interesting, because I look at the education system, as you say, and it forces you to make choices very early on that can sort of have longer term implications. And I think, to some extent, the UK is at least flexible in that there are plenty of careers that you can jump into post-university or post-school where training fits in, and they sort of accept the fact that you don't know anything about it. So I qualified as an accountant, not something I particularly talk about. And of course, as we have this conversation, I'm reflecting on why the hell did I do that? Well, I know, but it was a painful period, and I'm not very good at maths. And would I trust myself to put a set of accounts together? Probably not, right? But I think it's interesting that we sort of force people. And what I find fascinating is, in many respects, the things that require you to sort of make an early call, because that's genuinely what's needed. So doctors, architects, maybe even astronauts. Those things tend to come with that passion anyway. So you've got those kids waking up with that. They know very early on that that's what they want to do. And so in a way, that's sort of self-selecting piece. So that's fine. For those people, we could funnel them off and allow them to do that. But for everybody else, I agree. How the hell you are supposed to know what you are any good at or what you really enjoy as a career, aged 16, 18, whatever, is a real challenge. And yet that, we're putting a lot of weight on young shoulders to make that mind up. And I think that plays into this whole piece, which is sort of, we don't equip people with the ability to experiment a little bit, play around and follow their passions.
And I think as well, and this is actually what I like about behavioral science, because it's not a discipline. So the masters that we have, I don't actually ask for any particular degree. So if you have done well and you actually, you write a cover letter that says you're interested in behavioral science, then I would really consider you for being in the program. And I think maybe if more masters did that, so even kind of more mainstream masters where they are looking for you having done something in that discipline, if we have more people kind of actually taking a chance on somebody who did incredibly well, maybe writing a letter and saying, look, you don't have the background for this, so you want to look at these prerequisites, but that's up to you. But we would love to have you, in the class. So being a bit more forgiving, I think at master's level can get around it. But I always do think that kind of raises an issue again, that if you are privileged enough to be able to afford to go on to do a master's, that kind of opens the door to change to you, but you don't necessarily have it for other people. And of course, as we see executive masters being created, and we have, again, LSE, we have a number of these that I've been involved with, it's the same thing. So if you think about access, if we're creating opportunities to switch later on in life, we equally have to be really thinking about how do we open those opportunities to people who are just as fantastic, but might not necessarily happen to have the money at that particular moment in time, or actually be in the networks that they hear about those opportunities. But I think allowing people to switch is really, really important. And you use medicine as kind of this career for life. The first thing that I did when I moved to London was I was a director on the Health Economics Policy and Management Executive. And I had a number of doctors that came through who did actually change careers. So even within medicine, you see this is what I call like a kind of vocational career. We see these shifts. So allowing that is really, really important. But if we're going to start allowing that more and more often, thinking about how we open those access doors becomes very important. So we just don't end up with people who happen to have money being able to access what we're giving.
There are so many jobs out there. Behavioural science is a good example that wouldn't have existed X years ago. And whether not just the title, but the very function of it. And I think as we look at the 21st century, there are, and that's partly to do with technology taking over roles, but also the shift in what we need. I think it's really interesting to see that we've almost built pipelines or production lines, if you like, for career paths that in many cases no longer exist. And so the education system has developed a thing which sort of says we will generate this, because that's how we see the world. But actually the world has changed, and there are all these opportunities, particularly through digital, but also just in the way society is changing, for people to do things that were never envisaged before. I'm doing a role that my parents don't really understand, that I would never have dreamt of, because it would never have been presented to me in a kind of careers handbook.
And for me, adaptability is a skill that I would love to see come into secondary schools, because I think some people are more adaptable than others, but I think it's something that can be taught. Because I think the reason folk don't adapt, it's not because they're rigid in their way, but some people are genuinely risk averse about trying something new. And it kind of tends to kind of be, it's complicated because it's meshed with confidence. But giving people kind of the skills to be able to say, actually, this is a new opportunity. It's quite different to what I've been doing before, but it's okay to give it a go and okay not to do incredibly well, also allows people find their careers. So I think when I meet people and if I'm interviewing people, somebody who really kind of signals to me that they're adaptable is a really important skill these days for exactly what you just described. So, you want people who are going to be able to kind of do podcasts, do writing, kind of meet people, do lots of other things that I might not necessarily be able to imagine. And I would love to be honest, work with people who actually told me things that I can't imagine. So I'm actually ahead of the curve for once, rather than kind of going 2 steps behind everyone else. But then you do have to really embrace, this idea of adaptability as a skill. And if we do that, then it has to be taught in schools. And if you think about kind of the fourth industrial revolution and technology shifts, things like resilience, things like adaptability, problem solving and creativity are probably the 4 big things that we really want kids to be able to have. And not just solve a particular problem because it's in the format that it's been given, but to be able to be given a complex problem on a particular day and really come up with ideas. And I don't think we're doing a good job at teaching that also. But yes, I mean, to adaptability, being able to move around careers and take opportunities as they come up, again, is something that I think we can actually open access to.
Wow. I was reflecting on Rory Sutherland makes a great point around maths problems, where you sort of have, 2 buses are moving in opposite directions at the same speed, blah, 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 blah. When does that ever happen? Right? And why is that? It's not a real world problem that anyone ever needs to solve. Because even if you work in a transport authority, it's a useless, and of course that's not what it's there to do, but it does set the frame. There's a lot of things that we test because we can.
Yes.
And sort of we've always tested this is a useful, but you're right. I think critical thinking.
Yes.
Massively, massively important nowadays, because we see lots of examples of people possibly not thinking, but certainly not critically thinking, and adaptability and resilience and these sorts of pieces. And I think that's a really interesting point, in that when one looks at, what do we need to be able to navigate these complex worlds, we need those skills and the traditional machine. And so as we look at this whole concept, actually, you could say the people that have the privilege have potentially been going through machinery that is not equipping them with the skills that we need them to have.
Absolutely. And this is how I think about behavioral science, to be honest, Christian. I think about it as you can strip away all the names of the cute biases, but you're teaching people to say, what's the outcome that I want to change? So let's imagine, because we're talking about inclusion today, that it's inclusion. So now inclusion is the outcome. So how do I think inclusion can be changed? So what evidence do I have? So what kind of biases am I bringing to that? So now what's my hypothesis? And how can I design something and actually test if it works? So really kind of, again, this comes down to, I mentioned health economics earlier, it's kind of the same skill that you might actually want somebody who's trying to come up with a cure for some illness. What's the outcome that I want? How can I think about changing that? What type of people do I need to get involved? And how can I figure out whether or not it's doing what I want it to do? And those core skills actually run through a lot of things, what we want to do in society. My public policy leaders, I wish they thought about things in that way. I want to change something. What's the lever I can pull? How do I know if it's working? All the way through from the imagination of the intervention to whether or not it's working. And in between, really pausing to think about ethics. There's not too many jobs that people are doing these days that they don't need those skills. And if you strip away a lot of actually other degrees, you'll find that the same skills are at the heart of it. It's about thinking about a problem, thinking about a creative solution, and figuring out whether or not the solution works. And the last part, which I think is really important, is asking if it's cost effective. So is there bang for the buck compared to other things that I could have come up with?
Right, because very often there's conclusions are reached about things that are theoretically perfect.
Yes.
And we see interventions and solutions that, and it bothers me particularly when the person doing it knows it's crap. And so the background, I come from is kind of compliance and risk. You see a lot of processes that are put in place so that you can say you have a process. But actually the reality on the ground, so I'm going to send loads of people on a really dull training course so that I can say I've sent everybody on a really dull training course. And everybody involved in the process knows it is a sham, but it's defensive decision making that allows it. And, the primary driver on that is not effectiveness. The primary driver is, backside covering.
I do wish sometimes that some of the people who roll out these things could go back to being 3 years of age when they ask why are we doing it? Why? Because a 3-year-old would never do that, right? A 3-year-old would never keep doing something that they didn't particularly like without at least constantly asking people why to a point where they will get an answer. And we do have to ask why, because you're right that, a lot of the things that we're actually doing as kind of processes are things that we don't know whether or not they work. And often we're not actually even sure the legacy half of the time. And actually, if you rip them up, some people in organizations will be very, very happy. So kind of really rethinking our status quo is very, very important. And that has baffled me, actually, I think in the last 10 years, is that always how if I have a new idea, it's compared to the status quo negatively before it ever begins. So it kind of puts you on the back foot in interventions. Whereas if you take kind of a drug trial perspective of it, it should be that you compare to what's actually happening, which is called do nothing, actually, by the way. So straight away, the frame is different. So we're thinking that we want to progress rather than stay the same, and really measuring effects in comparison to that. But yeah, I would love to see more people asking why.
That's really interesting, because I was talking to someone about behavioural interventions and sort of saying, am I bringing science to compliance mission? And they sort of said, well, before introducing this idea, we need some scientific evidence that what you're proposing works. And I said, well, there isn't going to be a scientific piece of research that I can pull off the shelf that tells you that this intervention is going to work in this way. Because even if I could pull that off the shelf, right, the circumstances under which that's been tested are not necessarily replicable in your world. And it was this strange thing where they is literally the bar for what I was proposing was ludicrously high in a way that you have never tested the existing methods. And somehow, because this is fresh thinking, I've got to sort of present it in a manner that passes a huge amount of obstacles. Whereas the traditional methods have, well, that's just what we've done. So that's fine. That's a given. And I totally agree. I love the way you depict that, because I think it is exactly, you wouldn't do that in any other context. Why are we doing it here?
But if you think about it, it's really the opposite of innovating. So again, like if you take pharmaceutical companies who do very well from coming up with new innovations that cure illnesses, they would never say, we need evidence before we actually start. They would say, what's the cheapest way that we can get evidence that there's a pulse that this might work without it being ethical? And then let's really think about actually kind of moving the needle. But whereas when we think about kind of leadership and how we treat people and how we, roll out kind of screening interventions, it's really the opposite. This is how we're doing it. So unless there's good evidence that the new thing is going to matter, we're not actually going to explore it. So mindset really matters going into this, actually. I think it's so important. And I think that there's no, it's not surprising that tech companies in particular embrace behavioral science much more than financial and professional services, because everything they do is A/B testing, regardless of what it is. They have a new product, they have a new idea. Everything is set up to, let's really figure out if it's actually working quickly and then kind of throw it away. And I think using some of the learnings from an industry that actually has had growth in the last decade and bring it to industries that haven't, this is really the one big lesson. So if somebody presents a new idea, don't just kind of say, this is how we've done it around here, or really show status quo bias, but actually think, how can I prove if it's an improvement and give that person a chance.
I love that idea of the opposite of innovating. I was trying to come up with the closest I could come up with was innovating.
So some of my worst conversations are with people when you give them ideas that you think could really, really work, and they almost give you a form to fill in order to make it happen.
Right? Yeah. Right. Interesting.
They're ticking the box already.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to pick up with you is a piece you just published that sort of is looking at practically when we think about inclusion and dealing with some of the challenges that we started the conversation with, is the practicalities of that. And you focus on this idea of gatekeepers as being really important for organizations to make sure that they can deal with some of these challenges. Can you unpick that a little bit?
Yes. So, I think that, if you can imagine, again, that there's 10 people in a room who are going to make decisions about folk within the organization, and they're all a particular type, I don't think we're going to get policies that are going to bring people within that organization along. So, sometimes when we talk about this, people would talk about that there's a pipeline or there's people missing. Very often, I don't necessarily buy that, but let's imagine if there is a pipeline issue, it's still not beyond the wit with other people into the conversation, to reverse mentoring, to bring people in externally. And I think very often the answer for that ends up being quite simple. It ends up being kind of a division between women and men. So, for example, if I have that boardroom of 10 people, because there's such a focus on gender diversity, it can be that the recommendation is to move to 3 out of 10 women. And I've chosen that number strategically because it is 30. We talk about 30% a lot. But I think in bringing those 3 new people into the boardroom, you need to make sure that they genuinely have a very different perspective to the 7 people who are already in there. Because otherwise we're getting gatekeepers that kind of replicate the same things that actually have come before. And I think even with the best intentions, so even if I'm sitting in that room and I have the best intention as a gatekeeper who walks in as one of the 3, if I don't either A, have a very different perspective for people, or B, take that time to get to know a different perspective of people and get reverse mentored myself and listen to other people's experiences, I'm not going to bring diversity to the table, regardless of me having different biology. And I think that's a really important point, a really important kind of point to make. What we want are these kind of gatekeepers that bring together perspectives so that we're not excluding people mechanically, actually. And just having a good heart doesn't necessarily cut it, unless you go and actually talk to people about what's actually what's holding them back, and listen to them and really try to bring down that barrier. So it's not your idea, but it's somebody else's idea, giving credit to them for that idea, but that you're the person advocating behind them.
And there's a really interesting logical kind of extremity of the conclusion here, which is to sort of say, actually, if you want to solve the problem, you don't necessarily, the most effective way isn't necessarily to bring someone in that looks like that is from the group you're trying to bring in, by having people in, clearly it's important. You wouldn't want no one in senior positions being representative, but actually they're not necessarily best equipped to always solve that problem because they're not the best gatekeepers. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think this is really important. So, if you take STEM, for example, so if we take particularly science, technology and engineering, medicine is a bit different. I think the best thing that you can actually do is look to see who a person who's going into a senior leadership role has encouraged in the past, who they've invested in the past, where their team members have actually gone with respect to kind of going along the pipeline. If it's venture, who they've actually invested in, you can look at that quite easily, rather than just doing it kind of down the line, a line of biology. Because what we really want are people who are at the table at this point, who really want to bring different types of folk along based on their skills, ability, and talent. We don't want people at the table who want to bring different types of folk along just because they happen to have a particular biology or a particular other trait that isn't correlated with skills, ability, and talent. Because our problem has been that we've excluded real skills, ability, and talent from opportunities for a very, very long time. And if you find somebody who's bringing people along and bringing them along effectively and pushing down their barriers and having hard conversations with other folk when they need to make sure that pathway kind of keeps going, that's the person that you want. That's the person that you want at the table, not just because for a fairer society, but it's actually better for business. You want your leaders to always be investing in the people who have the highest skill, high ability, and high talent. And there would be something strange about that if the person always has the same gender as you, if the person always has the same ethnicity as you, if the person always has the same beliefs, because that's not how skills, ability, and talent are distributed.
That's a big sort of step for some people to make, because they kind of look at it as, I have a problem to solve, and I'll take my org chart and I'll get some pictures on the org chart, and then I'll know when I've solved the problem, because the org chart will look, more diverse than it did. And of course, that runs out of, that sort of is right from a visual perspective, but it runs out, unless your org chart goes all the way down the organization, has every single face on it, that's not going to necessarily help you. But that cognitive diversity piece is something that people haven't really been focusing on. And I think is really interesting. I mean, very provocative in a way, because people will naturally say the simple way to solve this is the picture needs to look right. And actually what you're saying is it's the brain power and the attitude that's more important. And so going and looking for that is a lot harder.
But when you think about cognitive, and I think this is where the picture goes wrong. So when you think about cognitive diversity, the idea of the picture is right. So for example, people who have come from a working class background are going to have had different life experiences to people who have not come from a working class background. So you do want to blend them within the organization and have those folk around the table. Equally, women have different life experiences as compared to men. So there would be something weird if I was claiming that I had cognitive diversity in my company, but I was still looking at all men around the table. So it is the point. But I think the rush for biology has meant that sometimes we're matching people who have the same beliefs as the folk around the table. So we can't see inside individuals' heads. So the picture is still a pulse. But along with the picture, there's two other things that need to happen. So firstly, we need to be looking to see whether or not people are included in the conversation throughout the organization. But I think the next thing is that we need to be looking to see who leaders are actually bringing along. And it needs to come outside just looking at whether or not they're bringing enough women. We need to be looking at what's the background of the people that they're bringing along. What's the race? What's the ethnicity? What are the attitudes of the people that we're actually bringing along? What type of customers are they representing? And then you still have the same picture, but actually you'll end up with a much more innovative group of people. They'll be much more creative. You'll end up representing your products creating products for your customers that are much more fit for purpose, because you have that different view. So I think cognitive diversity is what we aim for, but very often we take this kind of shortcut that relies on us actually picking people who are too homogeneous with respect to ourselves, with respect to cognition, rather than really appreciating the views of other people. And I think that's where, if we think about growth, that's basically where we need to get to.
Right. And I think that's really interesting in the context of the world that we're in today. I mean, the very simple thing is, when I look at it and say, when things go wrong in organizations, someone somewhere knew something, might not have known the full thing, but had an idea it was going on. And so organizations don't even tap into the experience of their staff at the moment. If I think about, a CEO who's been in the company for 30 years is not necessarily going to have a handle on some of the social dynamics, some of the technological dynamics that are particularly important either for the customers or on the ground. And we're not tapping into those pieces at the moment. So we're sort of deficient with the population that we have, which is, and you can see lots of companies collapsing very quickly nowadays under the weight of not having spotted a shift in patterns. And I think it's interesting when you look at things like Facebook and seeing how wrong they are being on a number of issues where I think they're going to have to shift. So even a technology company's getting this stuff wrong. If we really want to get this stuff right, you need to get more of those. That cognitive diversity, I agree, becomes really important because you want as many people within your organization helping you to think about your strategy, your risk management, your whatever. Because otherwise you're not going to survive. I don't think this is even a sort of nice to have. This is like a basic survival point.
Yes, no, I like that you said even technology companies are getting it wrong. I mean, technology companies get it wrong a lot, actually, when it comes to inclusion. So I think the A/B testing is something that they do incredibly well, but they do actually, they do get it wrong. But I think more than that, the companies that have had huge conduct risk scandals, if you look back, yes, people knew about it, but they also were telling about it. So they were actually telling leaders about it and they weren't listening. And I think that's been kind of the interesting thing kind of for me looking back is if you kind of think about incentives within organizations, the incentive for anybody to speak up at any one time is still pretty limited, even with the kind of anonymous speak up channels at the moment, to be very honest. But nonetheless, it's a bit better than it was. But we do see evidence of people speaking up. But I think it's not being listened to by the senior people is really what needs to shift. And I always find this really, really interesting and I hope I never change because it seems to happen so much with leaders that they get into these really senior positions and they have ideas and they really want to execute them, which is how it should be as leaders. But they should question where the ideas come from. And it should come from listening to everyone in that organization because it's those people that represent the folk who, whatever service you're providing or whatever customer you're providing. For most, I think like 85% of companies, it's those people are a better representation than yourself. So I think it's the listening part is often missing. And that's what I kind of think about when I think about inclusion is kind of listening to people, taking on their ideas, and then kind of almost coming up with a super idea that blends them together. And that's that integrative skill is really, really hard. So it's easier to say than do. But that's where we get growth.
That's a really interesting combination of two things I'd never really linked, which is the sort of the bad behavior, conduct, zero challenge world. There's a strong linkage then to the sort of solving some of these other challenges, because clearly if you are not in listening mode and not genuinely listening, as opposed to saying I'm listening and not actually doing it, but if you're genuinely not in that kind of listening collaborative mode, then you're not going to want to bring people in who are going to bring fresh ideas that might challenge your way of thinking. So not only are you leading yourself down a sort of bad conduct path, but you're actually not going to solve this fundamental piece. And I wonder, if anything's been done on looking at those two pieces, because I would say clearly when things have gone wrong, you haven't had the right number of people speak, being either speaking up or being heard. And of course, when we look at the diversity and inclusion piece, that is all around bringing in different voices. So there is this huge overlap between those two pieces. I think I hadn't made that linkage before, but there's probably a strong correlation between lack of diversity and poor conduct.
Yes, there is. I mean, there are correlations, so there is evidence there. But very often in places where we've had poor conduct, we haven't had enough diversity in order to be able to actually take this.
So it sort of proves the point, but not in a scientific way, right?
Take this seriously as a question. Yeah. Do you know John Coates, who wrote the book The Hour Between the Wolf and the Dog? So he does these experiments on traders and he talks about the relationship between testosterone. And he had an extraordinarily small number of women in his sample. So it did point in the direction that you just described, actually. However, because the sample was so small, he rightfully was very kind of reluctant to actually draw any conclusions. And I don't know, did somebody take something out of a book, but I remember it ended up on the front of the Financial Times basically saying having women, on trading floors would have actually lowered conduct risk. So I think that it suggests that diversity kind of suggests that we're less likely to we're less likely to be badly behaved if we're surrounded by people that are different to us. In the lab, it comes out of the lab in the kind of cheating games, the Dan Ariely cheating games. It certainly comes out of that. But in companies, we don't have huge amount of evidence yet. But again, it's something because I've seen some correlations. I've seen the lab evidence. The theory lines up. So if you think about it, I'm probably much more likely to be comfortable being bad if I'm likely to cheat, if I'm around someone that's like me, because I'll imagine them thinking the same way, than if I'm around people who are actually quite different to myself and give different life perspectives. So I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk, but there is evidence to suggest that you're on the right direction.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because it's easier to persuade them, right? Because I know how they think.
Yes.
And therefore I'm very likely to be able to concoct a narrative that works for them.
And I think even some of Dan Ariely's lab work actually shows that I'm much more likely to cheat if I'm in it with somebody that's like myself and the stakes are lower than I am on an individual basis if the stakes are particularly high, which is quite interesting as well. So if I'm giving it to somebody like myself, I tend to feel good about myself. And I guess that's kind of all this idea of familiarity bias, and we have kind of these in groups that operate together. So again, if you think about ways in which to kind of change how they actually operate, bringing in different perspectives really, really matters. And I think the reason it doesn't happen most times isn't because people don't want to do it, because actually as a leader now in an organization, nothing would look better than having a group of people who have different life perspectives around the table. It would be really, really good for you. But I do think that there's a step that when you bring people together from different perspectives where you need this integrative leadership, and we haven't really figured out how to hire, we don't value integrative leadership enough actually at the moment, I think is a step that's missing.
And what's coming up on the agenda now? Because obviously this is on the one hand, the issue isn't particularly fast moving. We all recognise it, but there are lots of things happening. What's next on your radar? As I said in the last time we spoke, my social media feed is filled with things coming out of your world. But what's sort of up next on the agenda, and what can we look to see in terms of research and projects? I
mean, so the big project that we're hoping to get funded by November is an idea of creating an inclusion index, basically using data that's external to firms and linking to profit and loss and linking to conduct risk. And the reason that we basically want to do that is we think for passive investors, if we show these clear links, that they're going to be likely to use it and hopefully choose investments based on it, so we can inspire people to be more inclusive and get all the great gains that I keep banging on about, so people be more creative, better products, so in some ways getting shareholders to work with me would really help. And I think second to that is actually working on some experiments within firms. So I'm doing some stuff on conduct at the moment, actually, just really thinking about how when we have these kind of big events where people behave badly, how we can actually change their behavior beyond just thinking about, firing them or giving them huge penalties, but also on the kind of happier side of life, how we can actually think about bringing different voices together. So there's going to be a lot around inclusion, but I'm hoping it's going to be different in the sense that I really believe the correlations are there. The lab evidence is there to suggest that inclusion does enhance, product outcomes, profit and loss, better conduct risk. And I'm hoping not just through myself, but through other colleagues that will come and work with us at the LSE, that we'll have lots more literature that talks more to causality. So that's kind of the big picture of what's coming. But hopefully at the weekend, I'm going to a restaurant, so I'm going to be COVID careless and head out for something to eat. So that's why I'm really excited about London opening up again.
Fantastic stuff. Listen, that was brilliant as ever. And a lot of fun. So thank you so much for that. I am sure that I'm going to be itching to get you back on the podcast at some point soon. So hopefully this hasn't put you off returning for a third time, and we'd love to make that happen. But thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you. It's been amazing, and happy summer, everybody.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Grace for appearing again, and to you for listening. To find out more about Grace and her research and other work, have a look in the show notes. Details are there. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. If you'd like to subscribe, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. kite.link/human will take you to all the different options. Thank you so much for listening. As ever, a new podcast will be out very soon on this channel, so look out for that. In the meantime, remember to wash your hands, wear a mask, and above all, stay safe. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you very soon on the Human Risk Podcast.